This is the story of Hanani, the brother who dared to speak when silence would have been safer. The lesson of his story is this: sometimes telling the truth to those in power may cost you comfort, but it will always honor God. Once upon a time, behind polished corridors and towering walls in the Persian citadel of Susa, Hanani carried a message that would disrupt peace, but ignite hope. The winter court moved like a clock. Scribes bent over tablets, guards paced the galleries, and courtiers measured their words. Hanani stood just beyond a carved doorway, travel dust still clinging to his cloak. He had crossed deserts and river roads with a report that pulsed in his chest like a drum. The steward nodded him through. At the far end, Nehemiah, cupbearer to King Artaxerxes, examined a sealed flask for purity, then dismissed the tasters with a quiet gesture. When Nehemiah saw the traveler, his eyes warmed. "Hanani," he said, voice low, "you made it." They embraced briefly. That simple touch split two worlds, comfort and ruin. Nehemiah guided him into a quieter chamber, away from listening ears. "Tell me," he said, "about the remnant, about Jerusalem." Hanani's throat tightened. Words can save. Words can wound. He could wrap the truth in soft cloth or hand it sharp as iron. He chose iron. "The survivors are in great trouble," he said. "The wall of Jerusalem is broken down. Its gates are burned. Our people live exposed." Silence. Outside, the court hummed as always, unbothered, efficient, glittering. Inside, Nehemiah's composure drained as if someone had opened a hidden vein. He set the empty cup aside and stared at the floor's mosaic: lions, palm trees, a river that never ran dry. "How many gates?" he asked finally. "Enough burned that nights feel longer than they are," Hanani answered. "Children learn the direction of fear. Traitors pass, but they do not stop. We bury dignity with our dead." He swallowed. "I will not tell you. It is slightly better than last year." "It is not." Nehemiah's hands pressed against the table's edge until his knuckles blanched. "And the elders?" "Brave," Hanani said, "but tired. Some mend. The wind unmends. Some watch. Sleep defeats them. A city without walls must borrow courage from thin doors." Nehemiah turned to the small window cut into the stone. The courtyard below glittered with bronze and blue tiles. "Here," he murmured, "even the shadows are painted." He faced Hanani again. "Why risk coming?" "You could have sent a letter." "Because letters lie without meaning to," Hanani said. "They can't look a brother in the eye." He straightened. "If I softened this, I would be a traitor twice, once to our people and once to you." They stood very still. Somewhere in the palace, a bell chimed the next watch. Duty would summon Nehemiah soon, taste the wine, offer the cup, smile at the right moments. The machine of empire did not pause for a broken city. Nehemiah's voice grew faint. "What do you expect me to do?" Hanani did not blink. "Ask God." "Then ask the king." A thin, dangerous sentence. Ask the king of heaven, then ask the king of Persia. In this room, that order could reshape lives or end them. Nehemiah's gaze flicked to the doorway, to the footfalls of officials drifting closer, to the risks that multiplied like shadows at dusk. The safe path was simple. Thank your brother. Send a modest gift to the remnant. Carry on. Hanani lowered his voice. "I know what this could cost you. Your place is steady, your life arranged. If you speak, none of that is steady anymore." He drew a breath. "But if you do not speak, our people will forget the sound of courage." Nehemiah closed his eyes. When he opened them, they were wet, less with grief than with decision forming. He reached for Hanani's dusted sleeve and squeezed. "Stay near," he whispered. "If I fall, tell them I did not choose silence." Footsteps halted at the threshold. The steward's tone was soft and iron at once. "My lord cupbearer, the king calls." Nehemiah dabbed his eyes, steadying his breath. He took the polished cup. His hand still trembled. Hanani stepped back into the pillar's shadow as Nehemiah crossed the chamber toward the bright hall and the waiting throne. At the door, Nehemiah paused, half turning as if to anchor himself to the truth that had just entered the room. Hanani gave a single nod, the kind that meant, "Do not change the message now." Nehemiah stepped into the light. For days after that meeting, the citadel of Susa continued as if nothing had changed. Courtiers whispered, musicians played, and servants polished bronze mirrors until their reflections shone. But inside Nehemiah's quarters, something had changed. Something that could not be seen or silenced. Hanani's words had taken root. Each morning before sunrise, Nehemiah knelt in the small corner of his chamber, fasting and praying. Servants whispered that he had grown thinner, that he barely ate. The palace thought it strange, but Hanani knew what it meant. He could feel it every time their eyes met in the corridors. A burden had been passed from brother to brother, and it was burning both of them alive. One afternoon, Hanani sat in the courtyard beneath the carved stone lions. His friend Eliab, another Jew serving in a lesser post, found him there. "You've done something, haven't you?" Eliab said quietly. Hanani looked up. "Something. I've seen the cupbearer. He hasn't smiled in days. The king's table grows silent when he enters. Whatever you told him, it's heavy." Hanani exhaled. "I told him the truth." "And what has that truth done?" Eliab asked. "It's doing what truth always does," Hanani said. "Breaking what's false before it rebuilds what's right." Before Eliab could reply, the royal trumpet sounded from the upper hall. "The king approaches!" a herald cried. Every servant, guard, and official fell silent. Hanani rose quickly. Through the marble arches, King Artaxerxes entered the grand hall, his robe trailing like a river of silk. Nehemiah followed, cup in hand, but his face was pale, his eyes shadowed. Hanani's heart seized. In Persia, sadness before the king was not allowed. It was seen as disrespect, an insult to the throne itself. The king studied Nehemiah. "Why does your face look so sad when you are not ill?" he asked. "This can be nothing but sorrow of heart." Silence rippled through the court. Hanani's fingers tightened around the pillar he stood behind. Nehemiah bowed low, trembling. "May the king live forever," he said, voice barely steady. "Why should my face not be sad when the city of my ancestors lies in ruins and its gates burned with fire?" Every breath in the hall seemed to freeze. The king leaned forward slightly, curious but unreadable. "What is it you want?" Hanani's stomach dropped. He wanted to shout, "Don't speak!" But he knew it was too late. Nehemiah closed his eyes for a moment, just long enough to whisper a prayer only Hanani could guess. Then he spoke. "If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, send me to the city of Judah to rebuild it." The queen looked up from beside the throne, her eyes searching Nehemiah's. "To rebuild?" she repeated softly, as if weighing the danger. The king turned to his advisors, who exchanged quick, uneasy glances. Finally, Artaxerxes looked back at Nehemiah. "How long will your journey take, and when will you return?" Hanani held his breath. This was not rejection. This was negotiation. Nehemiah answered carefully, "If it pleases the king, let letters be given to me for the governors beyond the river, that they may grant me safe passage, and one for Asaph, the keeper of the royal forest, to supply timber for the gates." A long pause followed. Then the king nodded slowly. "So be it," he said. "You have my permission." The court exhaled as one. Hanani nearly stumbled. His knees felt weak. When Nehemiah left the throne room that day, his eyes found Hanani across the marble floor. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. Both knew something sacred had happened, something that would change not only their lives, but the fate of a city far away. That night, Hanani found Nehemiah alone beside a lantern's flickering light. The letters were already sealed, lying neatly on the table. "You did it," Hanani said quietly. Nehemiah shook his head. "God did it. I only asked." He looked at his brother. "Now, will you come with me?" Hanani hesitated. "Leave Susa? Leave all this?" He glanced around, the quiet safety, the ordered halls. "Leave comfort," Nehemiah said, "for purpose." Hanani stared at the flame, watching it tremble against the parchment. His heart pounded. He had started this, spoken the truth, and now that truth was pulling him toward the ruins he'd only described. After a long silence, Hanani nodded. "If you go, I go." Nehemiah smiled faintly, his first in many days. Then let's see what God rebuilds when brothers stop running from courage. Outside, the night wind carried a faint sound, distant thunder rolling east. It sounded almost like the cracking of old stones giving way to something new. The road from Susa to Jerusalem stretched like a scar across empires, dry plains, guarded checkpoints, and lands where loyalty shifted with the wind. Nehemiah and Hanani rode with a small royal escort, the king's letters sealed in a pouch strapped to Nehemiah's side. Each scroll was heavy with favor, yet fragile as glass. The first few days were quiet. Soldiers led the way, their armor clinking rhythmically, while the brothers rode behind on borrowed horses. Hanani kept scanning the horizon. The desert sun bled across the hills, and dust turned the air into a dull haze. Every step forward brought both hope and risk. On the seventh evening, they stopped near the border fortress of Damascus. The soldiers set up camp, and Nehemiah unrolled a worn map by the firelight. "Once we reach the province of Samaria, word will spread," he said. "Governors talk faster than merchants. We'll be known before we arrive." Hanani studied the flickering light on his brother's face. "And not all will be glad to see us," he murmured. Nehemiah nodded. "That's why we carry letters. Favor is our first defense." But Hanani knew that paper couldn't stop arrows or jealousy. The more powerful the permission, the more dangerous the journey. Later that night, as the camp fell quiet, Hanani walked a short distance away. He could feel the weight of the task pressing on him. It wasn't just walls they were going to rebuild, it was faith. A city that once held God's name had been left in shame. Could a handful of men truly change that? The sound of footsteps pulled him from his thoughts. Nehemiah approached, wrapping his cloak tighter. "You're awake too," he said softly. "I can't sleep," Hanani admitted. "Every mile closer, I wonder if I did the right thing by telling you. I started something that may cost us both everything." Nehemiah looked toward the east, where the faint outline of the hills shimmered in starlight. "Maybe," he said, "but obedience always costs something." The question is whether it's worth the price. Before dawn, riders approached from the north, dust clouds and torchlight. The camp stirred. "Who goes there?" shouted one of the guards. The leading rider raised his hand. "Sanballat, governor of Samaria, under royal service," he called. Hanani's pulse quickened. He had heard the name whispered even in Susa. A man of influence, sharp tongue, sharper ambition. When Sanballat dismounted, his smile was cold and polite. "You must be the cupbearer from Persia," he said, looking Nehemiah up and down. "And your brother, I presume." "We are traveling under the king's orders," Nehemiah said, handing him a sealed scroll. "You may read it, if you wish." Sanballat broke the seal and scanned the words. His smirk never wavered, but his eyes hardened. "So," he said slowly, "you've come to rebuild what the king himself allowed to remain in ruin. Brave." Hanani stepped forward. "We've come to restore what God has chosen, not what men neglected." Sanballat tilted his head. "Be careful with such words. God doesn't sit on Persia's throne." Nehemiah met his gaze calmly. "No," he said, "but he rules it." The air between them tightened. Finally, Sanballat folded the letter neatly and handed it back. "Then by all means," he said, stepping aside, "go build your walls. I'll be watching." When he rode off, Hanani released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "He's already planning," he whispered. "I know," Nehemiah replied, "but so is God." That night, the brothers broke camp earlier than planned. The road ahead would not be easy. There would be traps, enemies, and rumors waiting to turn courage into fear. But as the stars faded into the pale light of dawn, Hanani felt something stir in him, a strange mix of dread and faith. He looked back once toward the fading horizon of Persia, the place of comfort they had left behind. Then he turned toward the land of their fathers. "Whatever happens," he said quietly, "we finish what truth began." Nehemiah nodded. "And we finish it together." The wind carried the scent of dry earth and promise. Ahead lay Jerusalem, still in ruins, but waiting for hands that refused to stay silent. When Nehemiah and Hanani finally reached Jerusalem, the city lay before them like a wounded giant. The walls were jagged teeth of stone, the gates burned down to black stumps, and weeds grew where soldiers once stood. It wasn't just ruin. It was memory decaying in silence. As they entered through what remained of the valley gate, the few families who still lived within the rubble watched quietly. Some stared with guarded hope, others turned away, too used to disappointment to believe in restoration. The air smelled of dust and ash, as though the fires of invasion still smoldered. That evening, Nehemiah gathered a handful of trusted men, including Hanani. He spoke in a low voice by lantern light. "We'll inspect the walls tonight, quietly," he said. "No announcements, no public meetings. We must see the truth for ourselves before we speak of rebuilding." Hanani nodded. "You don't trust the reports?" "I trust God," Nehemiah said, "but I also trust my own eyes." They waited until midnight. The city slept beneath a starless sky. Nehemiah, Hanani, and 3 others mounted horses and slipped through the broken gate. The hooves made soft, hollow sounds against the stones. Each ruin they passed whispered stories: homes abandoned, markets burned, children gone. They rode toward the dung gate first, where the stench of rot clung to the wind. "We'll start here," Nehemiah murmured, holding up his torch. The light revealed piles of collapsed stone and charred beams. Hanani dismounted, kneeling beside one of the larger stones. "These weren't just broken," he said quietly. "They were torn apart on purpose." Nehemiah's jaw tightened. Destruction is never content to ruin, it must humiliate. They continued along the southern wall, weaving between rubble and thorns. At one point the path grew so narrow that even the horses couldn't pass. The men dismounted and went on foot. The moon slipped from behind a cloud, lighting the ruins in pale silver. Hanani ran his hand across a blackened gatepost. "I remember when I first saw these gates burning," he said softly. "It smelled like the end of the world." Nehemiah glanced at him. "And yet here we are, breathing." By the time they reached the fountain gate, the torches had burned low. They stood on a ridge overlooking the eastern wall where the Mount of Olives loomed in the distance. The silence felt holy, like the earth itself was waiting. Nehemiah turned slowly, surveying the shattered perimeter. "This is worse than I thought," he said. "Every gate gone, every wall collapsed." Hanani stepped beside him. "Then we build from nothing," he said. "That's what faith does best." Nehemiah looked at him for a long moment. "You've changed since Susa," he said quietly. Hanani smiled faintly. "Truth changes a man. Once you speak it, you have to live it." The group began the long walk back to their quarters. Just before dawn, the city stirred to life. The sound of women drawing water, roosters crowing, hammers tapping from far-off workshops. To them, it was another day in a broken city. But to Hanani and Nehemiah, it was the beginning of something divine. When morning came, Nehemiah called the elders and priests to gather in the city square. Dust swirled in the sunlight as people filled the open space, curious. Nehemiah stood on a fallen stone and lifted his voice. "You see the trouble we are in," he said. "Jerusalem lies in ruins, and its gates are burned with fire. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, and we will no longer live in disgrace." The crowd murmured, uncertain. Hanani's heart pounded. Everything hinged on this moment, the courage of a city too tired to believe. Then one voice rose from the crowd, an old mason with gray in his beard. "If God is with you, then I'll build beside you." Another man shouted, "And I will bring my sons." Then another, then dozens. The noise grew until it was no longer murmuring, but resolve. Nehemiah looked toward Hanani, his eyes fierce with conviction. "The God of heaven will give us success," he declared. But as the crowd roared with new faith, Hanani noticed two men watching from the shadows near the edge of the square, Sanballat and Tobiah. Their expressions were calm, but their eyes burned with quiet hatred. Hanani leaned toward Nehemiah and whispered, "They're here." Nehemiah didn't turn his head. "Let them watch," he said. "They'll see what faith can build faster than fear can break." The morning sun spilled over the ruins like a promise, and for the first time in years, the name Jerusalem didn't sound like a memory. It sounded like a future. The morning after Nehemiah's speech, Jerusalem woke to a sound it hadn't heard in decades. The clatter of tools, the thud of stone, and the rhythm of rebuilding. The city that once echoed with mourning now hummed with motion. Dust filled the air, mingled with sweat and prayer. Hanani moved through the worksite from dawn till dusk, helping Nehemiah assign families to each section of the wall. The priests built near the sheep gate, merchants near the fish gate, and soldiers at the broad wall. Sons worked beside fathers, and even women carried stones with determined faces. "Keep your section small," Hanani called out to a group of masons, "but make it strong enough to stand through generations." One of them, a younger man named Malchiah, grinned through the dirt on his face. "You talk like this wall's going to preach sermons," he said. Hanani smiled back. "If we build it with clean hearts, it just might." By midday, the sound of hammers echoed like music across the valleys. From the top of the ridge, the progress was visible, broken lines slowly forming shape, patches of wall rising like faith made solid. But not everyone shared their joy. Beyond the hills, news traveled fast. In the nearby city of Samaria, Sanballat sat in his courtyard listening to a messenger's report. His fingers drummed against the arm of his chair. "Rebuilding? In Jerusalem?" he scoffed. "Who gave these ruins permission to hope again?" Beside him, Tobiah, the Ammonite official, smirked. "If a fox runs on that wall, it'll crumble." Sanballat rose to his feet. "Then we'll help it crumble. Gather the governors. I want mockery louder than their faith." That same afternoon, as workers labored under the sun, jeers began to carry from the northern hills. "You think you'll build a wall from ashes?" someone shouted. "You call that stone? It's dust." Hanani looked up. The noise came from a group of men on horseback, Sanballat and Tobiah among them. Their laughter was sharp, meant to slice through morale. Nehemiah didn't answer them. He simply stood on a section of rising wall, lifted his face to heaven, and prayed loud enough for the workers to hear. "Hear us, O our God, for we are despised." Turn their scorn back upon their own heads. The men kept laughing, but something changed in the builders' faces. They no longer looked afraid, they looked resolved. Hanani noticed it immediately. The way weary hands gripped tools tighter, the way backs straightened under the weight of stones. When the mockers finally rode away, Nehemiah turned to Hanani. "Let them talk. We'll let obedience make the noise." Hanani nodded. "Then we build faster." And they did. Days blurred into weeks. The walls began to connect, sections meeting like seams of old fabric made whole again. Hanani worked tirelessly, often sleeping on site with the guards. Some nights he'd wake to the wind sweeping through half-finished gates, whispering through the cracks as if the city itself were breathing again. One evening, he found Nehemiah seated beside a half-built tower, staring at the city below. "You haven't eaten all day," Hanani said, setting down a small loaf and a flask of water. Nehemiah smiled faintly. "I'll eat when the gates stand." "You won't stand if you don't," Hanani countered. Nehemiah looked up, his eyes rimmed with exhaustion but steady with fire. "Every stone we lift is a prayer answered. When I see these walls rise, I see what obedience looks like in daylight." Hanani sat beside him. For a while, neither spoke. The setting sun washed the ruins in amber light, and the workers' shouts turned to murmurs as the day ended. Then, faintly, a horn blew from the distant hill, the sharp note of warning. Everyone froze. Hanani leapt to his feet. "The watchmen, what do they see?" A guard ran down from the tower. "Scouts!" he shouted. "Enemy riders approaching from Samaria!" Within moments, chaos stirred. Tools dropped. Women hurried children behind piles of stone. Nehemiah raised his hand. "No panic," he commanded. "Half of you keep building. The other half, arm yourselves." Hanani moved quickly, helping men grab shields and spears. His heart pounded. "So it begins," he muttered. Nehemiah turned toward him, his voice calm but fierce. Let them come. God didn't bring us here to start something we can't finish. By the time the riders appeared at the horizon, the builders were no longer just workers. They were soldiers, standing shoulder to shoulder on the walls they had built. The rising moon glinted off their makeshift weapons, and for the first time in generations, Jerusalem looked ready to fight for itself again. Sanballat's messengers didn't attack that night. They only circled the city, watching, measuring the courage of the people. But Hanani could feel what was coming. The next time, they wouldn't bring words, they'd bring war. Still, as dawn broke, the sound of hammers resumed. No one left. No one surrendered. Hanani looked over the wall at the pink light spreading across the hills. They'll come again, he said quietly. Nehemiah, tightening the strap on his sword, replied, Then they'll find us praying with one hand and building with the other. The two brothers stood side by side as the sun climbed higher, ready for the next chapter of a war that wasn't just for a wall, but for a promise. The weeks that followed were not peaceful. By day, the sound of rebuilding filled Jerusalem. Chisels striking stone, iron nails clanging into wood, orders echoing across the valley. By night, the glow of torches lined the half-built walls as guards kept watch for approaching enemies. The people had learned to work with trowel in one hand and spear in the other. Hanani rose before dawn each morning, walking the length of the wall before the sun cleared the horizon. He checked on the builders, encouraging those whose arms were growing weary. The people were learning more than construction. They were learning courage. One morning, as the mist lifted over the city, Nehemiah joined him on the eastern ridge. You can see it now, Nehemiah said quietly. The wall almost meets on every side. Hanani nodded, wiping dust from his hands. Almost, but not enough to rest yet. A rider appeared through the valley, galloping hard. The guards opened the gate as he dismounted, breathless. A message from Samaria, he gasped. Hanani's stomach tensed. Nehemiah took the scroll, unrolled it, and read aloud. Come, let us meet together in the plain of Ono to discuss matters of peace. Nehemiah's eyes darkened. Peace, he said slowly. Written by men who plot ambushes. Hanani frowned. It's a trap. They think I'll leave the work, Nehemiah said. He folded the letter. Send them this reply. I am carrying on a great project and cannot come down. Why should the work stop while I leave it and go to you? The messenger bowed and rode off, but over the next few days, 3 more letters came, each one urging Nehemiah to meet, each one dripping with false friendliness. They're desperate, Hanani said as they stood over the walls one evening. Nehemiah nodded. Desperation is dangerous. It makes men unpredictable. By nightfall, the enemy changed tactics. Rumors began to spread. Whispers that Nehemiah was plotting rebellion against Persia, that he intended to crown himself king. Fear moved through the workers like a cold wind. Hanani gathered a group near the northern gate. You've heard the lies, he said, his voice firm. But lies are just words. Walls are truth you can touch. Keep building and let God defend our names. A woman named Adina, one of the builders, looked up from her mortar bowl. And if they come with swords? Then we'll meet them with faith and steel, Hanani said. Neither bends easily. That night, as moonlight stretched across the rooftops, Hanani sat with Nehemiah inside the half-finished tower. The flame between them flickered as the wind whispered through the cracks. Do you ever wish we had stayed? In Susa? Hanani asked. Nehemiah smiled faintly. Comfort is a prison, if it keeps you from calling. Hanani leaned forward. I think of that sometimes. The moment I told you about Jerusalem. How one truth has brought us here, between danger and destiny. Then remember this, Nehemiah said. Truth may invite battle, but silence surrenders everything. The next morning before the gates opened, a new visitor arrived, a prophet named Shemaiah, known for his mysterious insight. He summoned Nehemiah privately. Hanani followed close, uneasy. Inside a dim chamber, Shemaiah spoke quickly. They are coming for you tonight, he warned. Men from Samaria, assassins. Hide yourself in the temple and bar the doors. Hanani's hand instinctively went to his sword, but Nehemiah's face remained calm. Should a man like me run away? He asked. And should one in my position go into the temple to save his life? I will not go. The prophet hesitated, his eyes darting away. Hanani saw it, fear, but not the holy kind. You were hired, weren't you? Nehemiah said quietly. Sent by Sanballat to scare me into sin. Shemaiah said nothing. The silence was answer enough. When they stepped back into daylight, Hanani exhaled. They'll try everything, fear, deceit, bribery. Nehemiah nodded. Then we'll counter with one thing they can't imitate: integrity. Over the next days, the people worked harder than ever. Hanani's voice became the rhythm of the wall, shouting orders, calling rotations, waking guards who nodded off at midnight. He carried a sword at his side and a trowel at his belt, a living reminder that faith does not stand still. It fights and builds at once. When exhaustion struck, he reminded them, every stone we raise is a testimony. Every gate we finish declares that God still chooses his people. At last, after 52 relentless days, the final gap closed. The last gate was hung. The watchmen took their places, and the people gathered in stunned silence to look at what their obedience had done. The wall stood unbroken. Nehemiah stepped forward, his voice trembling with emotion. They said it couldn't be done, he said. But our enemies see now. This work was accomplished by the hand of God. Hanani turned his face toward the horizon. Sanballat's banners were gone. Tobiah's riders had retreated. The taunts that once filled the air were replaced by the sound of children laughing between the stones. As the sun set behind the rebuilt towers, Hanani felt tears sting his eyes. For months he had carried fear, exhaustion, and pressure. But now, standing on the walls of a restored city, he carried something new: peace. Nehemiah joined him on the rampart, looking out across the golden rooftops. We did it, Hanani whispered. Nehemiah smiled faintly. No, he said. God did. We just refused to quit. Below them, torches began to glow one by one until the whole city shimmered like a crown of light against the night. For the first time in generations, Jerusalem stood strong, and the people of God remembered what courage could build. But as Hanani watched the stars rise, he knew the real challenge was still ahead. It wasn't just about building walls. It was about keeping faith inside them, to be continued. The celebration of the completed wall lasted for days, but joy, like mortar, can begin to crack under pressure. When the cheers faded and the workers returned to their homes, Hanani began to notice a change in the air. The threat outside the walls had quieted, but a new threat had begun to stir within them. Jerusalem now stood tall, but her people, flush with success, were drifting into complacency. The nobles argued over grain prices, merchants haggled for profit instead of fairness, and whispers of favoritism began to hum like flies near the city gate. Hanani had seen such decay before, not in stone, but in hearts that forgot who had given them victory. One afternoon, Hanani walked through the bustling square. Children played beside the rebuilt towers, and traders shouted from their stalls. From the outside, everything looked perfect. Yet as he passed the council chamber, he heard raised voices inside. The door was slightly open. "You can't keep taking interest from your own people," Nehemiah's voice rang out. A noble scoffed. "You expect us to lend for free? We risk our own fortunes." Hanani stepped in. His eyes met the men seated around the table. "You risk nothing compared to what God gave you," he said quietly. "This wall wasn't built to protect greed." The room fell silent. Nehemiah straightened. "He's right," he said. "Return what you've taken. Fields, vineyards, silver, everything. Restore your brothers." One of the nobles slammed his palm on the table. "You dare order us?" Nehemiah didn't flinch. "I'm not asking," he said firmly. "I'm reminding you who this city belongs to." The nobles glared, but the weight of the moment pressed harder than pride. One by one, they muttered their agreement. "I will give it back." "So will I." "And I." Nehemiah called for priests to witness the vow. As the men signed the pledge, Hanani whispered a prayer of thanks. Yet in his heart he knew, vows are easier spoken than kept. That night Hanani met Nehemiah on the southern wall, overlooking the valley. The torches burned low and the stars gleamed faintly through the thin clouds. "You handled them well," Hanani said, "but they won't forget the humiliation." "I don't need them to like me," Nehemiah replied. "I need them to fear God again." Hanani rested his arms on the wall. The outside enemies were simpler. They came with swords. These come with smiles. Nehemiah nodded grimly. "That's why we must stay watchful, not for what attacks from without, but for what rots within." The next morning, a messenger arrived at dawn. He carried no letter, only a warning whispered in haste. "Some of the nobles dine with Tobiah," he said breathlessly. "They send him reports." "Even your words." Hanani's stomach turned. "Spies? Among our own?" "Yes," the messenger said. "They speak of loyalty to God, but bow to influence." Nehemiah clenched his jaw. "Then we build something stronger than walls," he said. "We build conviction." As weeks passed, Hanani saw it all. Secret meetings in shaded courtyards, quiet bribes exchanged under the guise of gifts, and flattery whispered in exchange for privilege. The city that had been united by faith was beginning to fracture under prosperity. One evening, as Hanani walked home, a boy ran up to him, breathless. "My father says the wall will not last," he said. "He says men are already selling pieces of the stone for their own houses." Hanani knelt, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Listen to me," he said gently. "Walls don't stand because of stone. They stand because people keep their word. Tell your father to remember that." The boy nodded and ran off. Hanani stayed there for a moment, staring at the glowing city, so strong in daylight, yet trembling under the weight of pride. Later that night, Hanani found Nehemiah again, this time in prayer. The governor's voice was steady but burdened. "O Lord," Nehemiah prayed, "you gave us success when enemies surrounded us. Now give us humility when comfort tempts us. Don't let your people forget you." Hanani stepped closer. "Do you ever wonder," he asked softly, "if we'll always be rebuilding something? Walls, hearts, faith?" Nehemiah looked up, tired but resolute. "If that's what it takes to keep God near, then yes," he said, "we'll rebuild as many times as he asks." Hanani gazed out at the city, its lights flickering like fragile candles in the wind. "Then we'll keep watch," he said, "because revival doesn't end when the wall stands. It ends when we stop guarding what we built." The two men stood side by side as Jerusalem slept, one praying, the other watching, each silently aware that sometimes the hardest battles aren't fought with swords, but with faithfulness when no one's watching. 52 days. That's all it took for God to turn disgrace into strength, ruin into refuge. 52 days, and yet the rebuilding of Jerusalem had changed far more than stone and timber. It had changed hearts. As the sun rose on the morning the final gate was hung, the city buzzed with wonder. Men and women filled the streets, staring at the completed wall as if afraid to blink lest it vanish like a dream. The gates gleamed with fresh bronze, the towers stood tall and even, and for the first time in years, Jerusalem's people could sleep without fear of raiders in the night. Hanani walked the perimeter slowly, taking in every curve and corner. His calloused hands brushed against the cool stone. The sound of hammers was gone now, replaced by the softer noise of rebuilding life. Laughter, footsteps, prayer. Every voice he heard carried pride, gratitude, and awe. He turned to Nehemiah, who stood at the northern gate surrounded by elders and workers. "It's finished," Hanani said quietly. Nehemiah's eyes scanned the wall, his expression steady but full of reverence. "It's more than finished," he said. "It's redeemed." The people began to gather in the open square before the water gate. Ezra the scribe, dressed in white linen, stood atop a wooden platform built for the occasion. Beside him stood Levites and priests holding scrolls of the law. "Bring the book of the law of Moses," a voice shouted from the crowd. Ezra lifted the scroll high above his head. The people bowed low, faces to the ground. Then he began to read. His voice was strong, ancient, unshakable, carrying words that had not been heard aloud in Jerusalem for generations. As the words flowed through the square, people wept. Not the soft weeping of sadness, but the deep, cleansing cry of a people who finally remembered who they were. Hanani stood near the wall with the guards. He watched as old men lifted trembling hands, and mothers pulled their children close, whispering the sacred names of their ancestors. One woman turned to him, tears glistening in her eyes. "We forgot his words," she said. "And yet he did not forget us." Hanani's throat tightened. "That's mercy," he said softly. "It rebuilds what sin tries to erase." When the reading ended, Nehemiah raised his hands for silence. "Do not mourn or weep," he called out. "This day is holy to the Lord. Do not grieve, for the joy of the Lord is your strength." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Families embraced. Bakers handed out fresh loaves, and wine was poured. The sound of celebration rolled across the city like music. Later that evening, as the last light faded, Hanani and Nehemiah stood on the ramparts overlooking the Golden Valley. The smell of roasted grain filled the air. The city shimmered with life again. "Look at them," Hanani said quietly. After all the mocking, the danger, the threats, they're still standing. Nehemiah nodded, because they remembered who builds with them. He placed a hand on Hanani's shoulder. You were the first to speak the truth, brother. You carried a message no one wanted to hear. And look, truth became restoration. Hanani smiled faintly. I only told what I saw. God did the rest. They stood in silence for a moment, the night breeze brushing their cloaks. You'll stay in the city now, Nehemiah said. The people trust you. I want you to oversee Jerusalem with Hananiah, the commander of the fortress. You've proven yourself faithful. Hanani blinked, caught off guard. Me? Governor. Nehemiah's tone was calm but firm. You fear God more than you fear failure. That's the kind of man a city needs. Hanani turned toward the lights of the city below. He could see families lighting candles, men locking gates, priests tending fires on the altar. A living rhythm had returned to Jerusalem. Then I'll serve, Hanani said finally. But not for honor, for legacy. We'll guard this wall until the next generation learns to guard their hearts. Nehemiah nodded. That's how revival lasts. But even as they spoke, Hanani's eyes caught movement on the hills beyond the city, faint torches flickering in the darkness. He couldn't tell if they belonged to travelers or spies. Do you see that? He asked. Nehemiah squinted. Yes. The wall keeps enemies out, but it also draws their attention. Some will never stop watching, waiting for weakness. Hanani's jaw tightened. Then we'll stay ready. Nehemiah smiled faintly. A wall is strong when its people are stronger. The torches disappeared behind the hills. The wind shifted. The city below glowed, steady and bright, like a promise burning through the night. And though the work was finished, Hanani knew something deeper. Revival is never one moment. It's a continual choice. As he turned to leave the wall, the distant call of the shofar echoed through the valley, a reminder that even victory required vigilance. The days that followed were unlike anything Jerusalem had seen since the days of David. For the first time in generations, the people weren't running from destruction. They were returning to rebuild life inside the walls they had restored. Hanani rose early each morning, walking the streets as the sun spilled over the rooftops. Smoke from cooking fires curled gently upward. Children's laughter echoed between the narrow stone alleys. Merchants opened their doors again, dusting off goods long forgotten. Yet the city still felt hollow in places. Whole districts stood empty where no families yet lived. Nehemiah called a council in the main square. The wall stands, he said, but Jerusalem must breathe again. The city cannot live on stone alone. Hanani stepped forward. We must bring the people back, he said, not just to live, but to worship, to work, to raise families who remember the God who brought us home. And so began the Great Resettling. Officials went throughout the towns and countryside, urging families of Judah and Benjamin to return. Some hesitated. Life outside the city was easier, the land fertile, the neighbors peaceful. But Hanani visited them personally, speaking from his heart. He told them of the nights they worked with swords in their hands, of the prayers whispered into the dust, of the promise that Jerusalem was not just a place, it was a testimony. Come, he said to them, be part of what God is doing. The walls are ready, but they wait for the sound of your faith. Little by little, Families came, farmers, stonemasons, singers, and priests. Soon the city began to fill with the sound of footsteps and song. The once empty streets grew alive again, and with each new household, Jerusalem seemed to inhale hope. When the people were finally gathered, Nehemiah and Hanani organized a grand assembly in the square before the water gate. Ezra stood again with the scroll of the law. This time, it wasn't read to a handful of workers, it was read to an entire nation reborn. From dawn until midday, Ezra read aloud, his voice unwavering. The Levites moved among the people, explaining the meaning of the words so no one would misunderstand. Men wept. Women lifted their hands. Children listened wide-eyed as the stories of God's faithfulness poured into the streets. When the reading ended, the leaders fell to their knees, confessing their sins and the sins of their ancestors. Hanani watched as the crowd bent low, faces pressed to the ground. Their cries filled the square like a storm of repentance. "We have sinned," they shouted. "We have turned away, but you, O Lord, are righteous." Ezra's voice trembled with conviction. "Stand up and praise the Lord your God, who is from everlasting to everlasting." And then came the covenant renewal. The people vowed together to keep the Sabbath, to give their tithes, to honor God's commands, and to remain separate from the nations that had led them astray. Hanani helped record every name, line after line of families promising faithfulness. That night, as torches flickered along the wall, Hanani stood beside Nehemiah, watching the people disperse. "Do you hear that?" Hanani said softly. Nehemiah smiled. "It's not the sound of building anymore. It's the sound of belonging," Hanani finished. They stood there quietly, the hum of prayer and laughter rising from the streets below. For the first time in decades, Jerusalem wasn't just rebuilt, it was restored. Yet even in that peace, Hanani's heart stayed watchful. Revival, he had learned, was like fire. It burned bright but needed tending. He thought of the generations to come and whether they would remember the cost of these walls. As the last torches burned low, Nehemiah turned to him. "Hanani, I'm returning to Persia for a season to report to the king. You and Hananiah will oversee the city while I'm gone. Keep the gates guarded and the people steadfast." Hanani nodded, the weight of responsibility settling on him. "We'll guard not just the gates," he said. "We'll guard the hearts." Nehemiah smiled, clapping his brother on the shoulder. "That's what makes a wall strong." When Nehemiah departed days later, Hanani stood atop the newly restored towers, watching him ride into the distance. The city below glowed golden in the early light, its people stirring to another day of peace. Hanani whispered a quiet prayer. "Lord, let this generation never forget what you've done. Let truth remain stronger than comfort. Let this wall stand as long as hearts stand faithful." The wind rustled the banners along the rampart, carrying his words beyond the valley as if heaven itself were listening. Years passed, like sand slipping through calloused fingers. Jerusalem, once a skeleton of stone and sorrow, now stood proud. A city wrapped in laughter, trade, and new beginnings. Children chased doves through rebuilt courtyards. The scent of fresh bread drifted through open windows. The walls gleamed in the sunlight like they had been there forever. But Hanani remembered. He remembered the dust of ruin, the sound of swords scraping stone, the taste of fear when enemies mocked from the hills. He remembered how fragile peace could be, how easily comfort could dull conviction, and he feared what often follows revival, forgetfulness. He still woke before dawn each day, climbing the wall to walk its full length the same way he had done in the days of rebuilding. His steps echoed softly against the stone as he touched the cold surface with his fingertips. "This wall stands because truth did not bow to fear," he would whisper, the words like a vow. But as he looked down from the ramparts, he began to notice things that unsettled him. Merchants were opening their stalls earlier, even on the Sabbath. Farmers from the surrounding lands slipped through the gates to trade under the cover of dawn. The songs of gratitude that once filled the streets were being replaced by the noise of bargaining and argument. Hanani sighed as he reached the market square. It was crowded already. He saw one of the nobles, rich robes, polished sandals, haggling with a caravan merchant from Ammon. "You're welcome to sell as long as the guards don't see you," the noble said under his breath. "I can arrange that." The merchant grinned. "And your share?" The noble smirked. 10%. "And you say nothing of this conversation." Hanani froze. Anger flared in his chest. He stepped forward, his voice sharp as iron. 10% of sin still equals 100% rebellion. The noble spun around. "Governor Hanani," he said stiffly, bowing in mock respect. "Surely you understand the need for diplomacy and trade. We cannot wall ourselves off from opportunity." Hanani's eyes narrowed. "We built these walls to keep out corruption, not to trap it inside." The noble's smirk faltered. Around them, the crowd grew quiet. Hanani raised his voice. "If profit matters more to you than purity, then these stones are wasted. A city without holiness is just another fortress waiting to fall." He turned and walked away before the noble could answer, but the seed of warning was planted. Not everyone would heed it, but none could say they hadn't heard. That evening, Hanani met with the priest in the temple courtyard. The golden lamps flickered in the twilight, and the air smelled faintly of incense. "The Sabbath is fading," he told them. "The people have begun to trade again. They treat the holy day as another market." One of the older priests sighed. "They've grown used to comfort," he said. "When the walls were broken, they depended on God. Now that they're whole, they depend on themselves." Hanani clenched his jaw. "Then we remind them who built the wall in the first place." He wrote a letter to Nehemiah in Persia reporting what he had seen. "The people have begun to slip," he wrote. "Their zeal has turned to routine, their holiness to habit." Weeks passed before the reply came. It was short but firm. "I am returning. Keep watch until I arrive." When word spread that Nehemiah was on his way back, the city buzzed with both excitement and unease. Some rejoiced, others grew nervous. The nobles who had been trading in secret scrambled to appear righteous again. Workers hurried to patch cracks in the walls they had neglected. Hanani watched them all quietly. He could see the difference between guilt and repentance. One hides, the other changes. On the morning Nehemiah returned, trumpets sounded from the city gate. The governor rode through on horseback, his face older, but his presence no less commanding. The people cheered, though their voices carried a hint of caution. Hanani met him inside the governor's hall. "You came quickly," he said. Nehemiah dismounted and clasped his brother's arm. "When truth writes, I read fast," he said with a faint smile. But the smile faded as he looked around. "Jerusalem looks strong, but feels weak." Hanani nodded. "The walls still stand. But inside, something's crumbling." The next day, Nehemiah walked through the marketplace. What he saw turned his face to stone: open stalls on the Sabbath, priests distracted by profit, children speaking foreign tongues, and merchants from Ammon and Tyre selling goods at the very gates that God had once closed to idolatry. He stopped in the center of the market and raised his voice. "This is not why we rebuilt the wall." The noise died instantly. People froze where they stood. Nehemiah's tone thundered through the square. "Did you forget the covenant? The vow you made with your own mouths?" Hanani stepped beside him, arms crossed. "You traded your convictions for comfort," he said, sweeping his gaze over the crowd. "You built walls of stone, but tore down the walls of your hearts." A merchant tried to speak. "We meant no harm. Business must go on." "Business without obedience brings curses, not blessings," Hanani interrupted. Nehemiah's eyes blazed. "Shut the gates," he ordered the guards. "Lock them before the sun sets. No trader will enter until the Sabbath is done." The great bronze gates clanged shut. Dust rose in the still air as the echoes faded into silence. For the first time in months, the city grew still, truly still. That evening, Nehemiah and Hanani met by the northern tower as the sun bled red over the hills. The air was heavy with the scent of smoke and quiet conviction. "They'll be angry," Hanani said softly. Nehemiah nodded. "Then let them be angry. Better their anger than God's disappointment." Hanani leaned on the wall. "Do you think they'll ever learn? Every generation builds, forgets, falls, rebuilds again." Nehemiah smiled faintly. "Maybe that's what faith is, remembering long enough for the next generation to start from higher ground." Hanani looked out across the valley, where fires from traveling merchants flickered in the dark. "They'll try again next week," he said. "They'll camp outside the gates, waiting for us to tire of conviction." Nehemiah's voice was calm. "Then they'll learn we do not sell faith for convenience." And sure enough, they came. Merchants lining up outside the walls, calling to the guards, pleading for trade. For 2 Sabbaths they camped there, hoping the city would give in. But each time the gates stayed locked and Hanani himself stood watch through the night. One morning Nehemiah walked up beside him. "You haven't slept." Hanani shrugged. "Rest is easy when walls are weak. I'd rather stay awake." Nehemiah smiled. "You've always been the watchman, brother. From the moment you brought me the truth, you've never stopped guarding it." Hanani looked toward the horizon, where the first light touched the hills of Judah. "Truth is costly," he said, "but so is silence." Years later, when the city thrived again and Nehemiah's term ended, Hanani continued to serve faithfully. He was never rich, never celebrated, but he became known as the man who stayed steady. Children who were not yet born when the walls were rebuilt grew up hearing his name. They would point to him walking the wall and whisper, "That's Hanani, the brother who told the truth." He grew older, his beard silvering, his stride slower, but his eyes still sharp with conviction. Sometimes, when evening fell and the shofar called across the valley, he would climb the western tower and watch the torches being lit one by one. He would remember the first night he and Nehemiah arrived in ruins, the night they rode in silence through the city's broken gates. And he would whisper again, "Speaking truth cost me peace, but it gave a nation its soul." When Hanani finally passed into glory, the walls still stood. Jerusalem was alive. The covenant still held. No monument marked his name, no tablet bore his deeds, but the stones themselves told his story. They whispered of a brother who risked comfort to awaken courage, of a man who understood that truth doesn't always make life easy, it makes it eternal. And though his voice fell silent, heaven remembered every word he ever spoke in faith. Because one man told the truth when silence was safer, and through that truth, God rebuilt a nation